The moment a man introduces another woman with a title that belongs to his wife, he is no longer hiding what he values. Ariana Brooks learned that lesson beneath a chandelier worth more than most American homes. The ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel shimmered in gold and crystal as nearly 600 guests moved between marble columns and towering arrangements of white orchids. Senators, CEOs, philanthropists, and media personalities filled the room with practiced smiles and polished conversations. It was the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, the event William Sterling loved more than any holiday because it allowed him to stand beneath bright lights and be admired by people whose approval he collected like trophies. Ariana stood near the center of the room in a tailored red evening gown that caught the glow of the chandeliers and reflected it back with quiet confidence. At 42 years old, she carried herself with the calm elegance of a woman who no longer needed to prove her worth. Her dark skin glowed beneath the ballroom lights, and her posture remained effortless despite the weight of 100 curious eyes. For 12 years, she had attended events like this beside William. 12 years of charity dinners, fundraising campaigns, board celebrations, and award ceremonies. 12 years of smiling beside a man whose name appeared in magazines while her contributions remained invisible to everyone except those closest to the truth. Tonight felt different. She sensed it before a single word was spoken. William had barely looked at her all evening. His attention seemed fixed elsewhere, drifting repeatedly toward a young blonde woman standing near the stage. Madison Clark wore a white designer gown and an expression that seemed too confident for someone attending as a guest. Ariana had met her only twice before. Officially, Madison worked as a branding consultant for Sterling Enterprises. Unofficially, she had begun appearing everywhere William happened to be. Board dinners, private receptions, charity planning meetings. Ariana noticed patterns because she had spent years studying people. Patterns rarely lied. Across the ballroom, a string quartet finished a performance as waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes. The first toast of the evening would begin in less than 10 minutes. William stepped onto the stage, adjusting the sleeve of his black tuxedo as applause rolled through the room. He looked exactly as the magazines liked to photograph him. Wealthy, controlled, untouchable. Ariana watched him from her table without emotion. She had long ago learned that appearances often concealed far more than they revealed. William thanked donors, sponsors, and community leaders. His speech moved smoothly through familiar phrases about generosity, vision, and legacy. The audience responded exactly as expected. They laughed when he wanted laughter. They nodded when he wanted agreement. Then his eyes shifted toward Madison. Ariana felt something inside her become very still. William extended a hand toward the young woman. Madison smiled immediately and stepped onto the stage beside him. A ripple of curiosity moved through the ballroom. Ariana noticed several guests exchange glances. Others leaned slightly forward in their seats. Even before William spoke, the atmosphere changed. The room sensed a story unfolding. William placed a hand lightly against Madison's shoulder and smiled at the crowd. "Many of you know Madison Clark," he began. "She's been an incredible source of support over the past year." Ariana remained silent. Her fingers rested lightly against the stem of her untouched champagne glass. William continued speaking. "Her insight, loyalty, and presence have become invaluable to me." The words hung in the air. Guests looked from William to Ariana and back again. A few uncomfortable expressions appeared around nearby tables. Then came the sentence that changed everything. William smiled proudly and said, "Tonight, I'd like to formally introduce Madison as my companion." Silence arrived first. Not complete silence. The kind that exists beneath hundreds of people pretending not to react. Ariana heard the faint clink of glass somewhere near the back of the ballroom. She noticed a woman lower her eyes. A man beside her shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Madison smiled as though she had just received an award. William appeared completely unaware of the damage he had done. Or perhaps he simply did not care. Ariana looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Madison. Neither seemed capable of understanding what had just happened. The title of wife had not been spoken once. Not a single acknowledgement. Not a single gesture of respect. In front of 600 people, William had rewritten the room's understanding of who mattered. Ariana felt no urge to argue. No desire to defend herself. Anger never interested her nearly as much as clarity. And in that moment, clarity arrived with perfect precision. She set her champagne glass on the table before the first toast could begin. She rose calmly from her seat. Conversations around her immediately softened. Several guests watched her stand. Others pretended not to watch. Ariana adjusted the sleeve of her gown, lifted her evening clutch, and turned toward the ballroom exit. She did not hurry. She did not look back. Behind her, William continued speaking into the microphone, completely unaware that the most important person in his life had just decided to leave before the first toast was ever made. The elevator doors closed behind Evelyn Carlisle with a soft metallic whisper, sealing away the mansion, the trash bags, and 12 years of carefully managed humiliation. She stood alone beneath the pale lights of the federal building lobby, both black leather bags resting beside her feet. Around her, government employees crossed the polished floor carrying folders, coffee cups, and ordinary concerns. None of them knew that several feet away stood the woman who had spent more than a decade protecting one of the most admired fortunes in America. None of them knew that the empire featured on magazine covers was balanced on information sitting quietly inside two unremarkable bags. Upstairs, Dominic Astor was probably pouring another glass of wine. Chloe Beaumont was probably walking through rooms she already imagined belonged to her. And Margaret Astor, Dominic's mother, was almost certainly directing staff members to remove every trace of Evelyn from the house. The three of them formed a perfect alliance. Dominic provided the money. Chloe provided the illusion. Margaret provided the cruelty. Together, they believed they had finally removed the obstacle standing between them and the future they wanted. The irony would have amused Evelyn if the wound were not still fresh. Dominic had always mistaken confidence for intelligence. He believed wealth solved every problem because wealth had solved most of his. When investors became nervous, money reassured them. When reporters asked difficult questions, money redirected attention. When competitors challenged him, money bought leverage. Over time, he stopped recognizing risks that could not be purchased away. Chloe suffered from a different weakness. She believed proximity was power. She believed sitting beside a billionaire made her important. She believed wearing expensive jewelry created status. She had entered Dominic's world through admiration and remained through ambition. But Chloe never understood the machinery beneath the luxury. She admired the chandelier without asking who paid the electric bill. Margaret Astor was the most dangerous of the three. She had spent her entire life protecting a family name she believed mattered more than truth. In her mind, Evelyn had never truly belonged. No amount of success, discipline, or sacrifice could erase the fact that she viewed Evelyn as an outsider who had somehow gained access to rooms reserved for other people. Margaret smiled at charity galas, hosted elegant dinners, and spoke about values. Yet beneath every polished sentence lived the same belief. Some people deserve power. Others should be grateful merely to stand near it. Evelyn had seen that belief from the beginning. She had simply chosen peace over confrontation. The receptionist called her name. Evelyn lifted the bags and followed a quiet corridor toward a secure conference room. The walls were plain. The carpet was worn. Nothing about the building resembled the marble halls Dominic preferred. Yet for the first time that night, she felt something close to balance. Truth rarely lived in penthouses. It usually waited in ordinary rooms. As she walked, her phone vibrated. Dominic. She stared at the screen until the call ended. Seconds later, another message appeared. Where are you? Evelyn almost smiled. 12 years together, and he was finally curious about her location. Another message followed immediately. Mother says you took documents from the study. Return anything that belongs to the family. There it was. Not concern. Not apology. Not regret. Ownership. Dominic still believed everything connected to his life belonged to him. The woman. The house. The reputation. The secrets. Evelyn locked the phone and slipped it into her purse. A federal compliance officer opened the conference room door and greeted her with professional calm. Inside, a long table waited beneath bright lights. Several chairs were occupied by people whose names never appeared in magazines, but whose decisions could alter the future of companies worth billions. One chair remained empty at the far end. Waiting for her, Evelyn stepped forward carrying both black leather bags. Behind her, the door closed softly. Somewhere across the city, Dominic Astor still believed he had won. He had no idea that the first question waiting inside this room carried a date, a transaction number, and the power to bring his entire empire into the light. The oldest man in the room did not introduce himself immediately. He sat at the far end of the conference table wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive only because it fit perfectly. His silver hair was neatly combed. A legal pad rested beside his hand. Nothing about him suggested power until he spoke. Mrs. Carlyle, before we begin, understand that every statement made in this room will be documented. Evelyn placed both black leather bags on the table. That is exactly why I came. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The compliance officers exchanged measured glances. One attorney opened a folder. Another activated a recording device. Outside the conference room windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath the night sky, unaware that one of its most celebrated fortunes was about to face questions it had avoided for years. Evelyn unzipped the first bag. Inside were encrypted drives arranged with almost military precision. Fiscal years, transaction histories, internal transfers, offshore structures. Every document carried the careful organization of someone who had spent years preparing for the possibility that truth might someday need protection. The silver-haired attorney leaned forward. How long have you maintained these records? Evelyn looked at the drives. 12 years. Silence settled over the room. Not shock. Calculation. 12 years was not a collection. 12 years was a history. The attorney nodded slowly. And why keep them? Evelyn answered without hesitation. Because powerful men often ask people to forget things they should remember. Across the city, Dominic Astor was discovering a different kind of silence. His penthouse office occupied the highest floor of Astor Global headquarters. Glass walls overlooked Manhattan. Awards-lined polished shelves. Every object communicated success. Yet the room felt unusually small as he stared at his unanswered messages. For calls. 3 texts. No response. Chloe sat nearby in a cream-colored chair, scrolling through social media on her phone. She is being dramatic, she said lightly. She will cool down. Dominic did not answer immediately. Something about Evelyn's final words inside the mansion continued to bother him. Everything in my hands belongs to the truth. The sentence returned again and again. Not because it sounded threatening. Because it sounded certain. His assistant appeared in the doorway. Sir, legal just called. Dominic looked up. About what? The assistant hesitated. Federal compliance inquiries. The room became very still. Chloe lowered her phone. Dominic stood slowly. What inquiries? They would not provide details. For the first time that evening, irritation gave way to something sharper. Concern. Back inside the federal building, Evelyn opened the second bag. Paper records. Signed memoranda. Internal communications. Authentication keys. Handwritten notes. Years of carefully preserved information. One compliance officer flipped through several pages before stopping abruptly. His expression changed. The silver-haired attorney noticed immediately. What did you find? The officer rotated the document across the table. Several names appeared beneath a transaction summary. 2 names belonged to companies under investigation in unrelated financial reviews. The room grew quieter. Evelyn remained calm. She had lived with these documents for years. Their contents no longer surprised her. What surprised her was how easily Dominic had ignored their existence. The attorney looked at her carefully. Did Mr. Astor know you retained copies? Evelyn thought of the mansion. The portraits. The wine glass. Chloe smiling beside him. No. Why not? A faint sadness touched her expression. Because he stopped paying attention a long time ago. The answer lingered in the room. It was not merely about documents. It was about marriage. Respect. Blindness. Success had taught Dominic to monitor markets, competitors, and public perception. Yet somehow he had stopped seeing the woman closest to him. Midnight passed. The conference room lights remained bright. Hours slipped by as questions continued. Dates. Transactions. Authorizations. Shell companies. Internal approvals. The compliance team filled pages with notes. More than once, attorneys exchanged looks that suggested the situation was becoming larger than they initially expected. Meanwhile, Dominic received another phone call. This time from the family attorney. Dominic, the attorney said immediately, where is Evelyn? His stomach tightened. Why? Because several agencies have requested information. The city lights beyond the office windows suddenly looked colder. What kind of information? A pause followed. the kind that usually appears before an audit. Dominic slowly lowered himself into his chair. Across from him, Chloe's confidence began to fade. For the first time all evening, neither of them spoke. Back at the federal building, the silver-haired attorney finally closed his folder. Mrs. Carlyle, I believe tonight is only the beginning. Evelyn looked through the glass toward the distant skyline. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the mansion she had left behind. Somewhere Dominic was still trying to understand what had happened. The attorney folded his hands. There is one final question. Evelyn turned back toward the table. What is it? He studied her for a moment before speaking. If you protected this empire for 12 years, what made tonight different? Evelyn's eyes lowered briefly to the wedding ring imprint still visible on her left hand. When she looked up again, her voice was steady. Tonight was the first night they showed me exactly what they thought I was worth. The room fell silent. But far away, inside Aster Global headquarters, an urgent email had just appeared on Dominic's screen, and the subject line contained a name he never expected to see. Dominic Aster stared at the email as though the words might rearrange themselves into something harmless. They did not. The sender belonged to a federal compliance division. The language was formal, precise, and impossible to misunderstand. Certain financial records connected to Aster Global had been identified for immediate review. Additional requests for documentation would follow. Dominic read the message twice, then a third time. Across the office, Chloe Beaumont slowly lowered her phone. What is it? She asked. Dominic did not answer immediately. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness below. For years, that view had reassured him. It reminded him how far he had climbed. Tonight it felt different. Tonight the city looked indifferent, as if it could continue perfectly well without him. Behind him, the family attorney remained on speakerphone. Dominic, listen carefully. Do not delete anything. Do not move assets. Do not contact anyone connected to flagged transactions until we understand what triggered this. Dominic's jaw tightened. You think Evelyn did this? The attorney hesitated. I think your wife knows things most people do not. The call ended several minutes later, leaving silence behind. Chloe crossed the room and placed a hand lightly on his arm. This is probably nothing. Dominic looked at her. For the first time all evening, he noticed how little she actually understood. Chloe knew private jets, charity galas, luxury resorts. She knew photographers and invitations and social influence. But she had never sat through a 14-hour restructuring meeting. She had never negotiated with lenders. She had never repaired a balance sheet at 2 in the morning. Evelyn had done those things. Chloe misread his expression as reassurance and smiled faintly. That was her mistake. Meanwhile, several miles away, the federal building remained awake long after midnight. Evelyn sat alone in a smaller conference room reviewing documents while investigators organized materials from the 2 black leather bags. Through the glass wall, she could see attorneys moving between offices carrying folders. Questions were multiplying. So were concerns. One compliance officer approached her table holding a thick file. Mrs. Carlyle, there is something you should know. Evelyn looked up calmly. What is it? He placed the file before her. Several transactions match information from previous investigations. Evelyn studied the pages. The names were familiar. She had seen them years earlier. At the time, Dominic dismissed her concerns. He called them administrative irregularities, temporary solutions, routine adjustments. She remembered sitting across from him in his office overlooking Central Park. He had smiled confidently and assured her everything was under control. Back then, she wanted to believe him. Marriage sometimes encourages optimism where caution would be wiser. The officer waited. Did you raise concerns? Evelyn nodded. Several times. What happened? A quiet sadness touched her voice. I stopped being heard. The answer carried more weight than she intended, because the truth extended beyond financial decisions. For years, Evelyn had offered warnings. About risks. About reputation. About people, including Chloe. Dominic listened less with each passing year. Success created an echo chamber around him. Eventually, only admiration reached his ears. Criticism became invisible. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the mansion felt strangely unsettled. Margaret Astor sat alone in the library wrapped in a cream cashmere shawl. The house was quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock. She had expected satisfaction after Evelyn left. Instead, she felt restless. Staff members moved carefully through hallways. Even the servants sensed something had changed. Margaret picked up her phone and called Dominic. He answered immediately. "Mother, have you found her?" "No." "Then find her." Dominic rubbed his forehead. "This is more complicated than that." The pause that followed felt unfamiliar. Dominic rarely admitted difficulty. Margaret straightened slightly. "What happened?" He hesitated before answering. "Federal inquiries." The words landed heavily. Margaret said nothing. For the first time all evening, she remembered the 2 black leather bags. She remembered Evelyn carrying them through the foyer. She remembered the confidence in her eyes. A small crack of uncertainty appeared. Across the city, Evelyn stepped toward a window overlooking Lower Manhattan. Dawn remained hours away. The skyline shimmered beneath darkness and reflected against the glass. For 12 years, she had helped build Dominic's empire. 12 years of solving problems nobody else noticed. 12 years of protecting a man who eventually stopped seeing her value. Yet standing there, she felt something unexpected. Relief. Not triumph. Not revenge. Relief. The burden of carrying secrets alone was finally ending. Her phone vibrated softly. A new message appeared from an unknown number. She opened it. Only 6 words filled the screen. "We need to discuss the board." Evelyn stared at the message. The sender's name caused her pulse to slow. Because it belonged to someone far more powerful than Dominic Astor had ever realized. And for the first time since leaving the mansion, Evelyn understood that the real shift in power had only just begun. The message remained on Evelyn Carlisle's screen as Dawn slowly approached beyond the federal building windows. "We need to discuss the board." 6 words. Nothing more. Yet those 6 words carried more weight than every threat Dominic Astor had ever delivered. The sender was Arthur Whitmore, chairman of the Astor Global Board and one of the most respected figures in American finance. Arthur rarely contacted anyone directly. He preferred distance, structure, procedure. When men like Arthur reached out personally, it meant something had already shifted behind closed doors. Evelyn stared at the message for several seconds before responding. "I am available this morning." The reply arrived almost immediately. 7 o'clock. Private conference room. No attorneys. No public records. Arthur never wasted words. Across Manhattan, Dominic had not slept. His office lights remained on while analysts, attorneys, and advisors moved in and out carrying reports. Every hour brought another uncomfortable discovery. Compliance requests. Document preservation notices. Questions from financial institutions. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to create pressure. Enough to create fear. Dominic sat behind his desk staring at a photograph taken 8 years earlier. He and Evelyn stood together at the opening of Astor Global's first international headquarters. She wore a red dress. He wore a black suit. Reporters praised his vision. Investors celebrated his leadership. Looking at the image now, Dominic noticed something strange. Evelyn appeared calm. Not proud. Not excited. Calm. As if she already knew something everyone else missed. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The family attorney entered carrying a folder. The board chairman requested an emergency meeting. Dominic looked up sharply. "When?" 8 o'clock. Dominic frowned. "Why was I not informed first?" The attorney hesitated. "Because he scheduled it before notifying you." The room fell silent. For years, Dominic controlled every major conversation inside Astor Global. Suddenly conversations were happening without him. Meanwhile, Evelyn arrived at the private conference room shortly before 7. The room overlooked the East River. Morning light reflected across the water. Fresh coffee sat untouched on the table. Arthur Whitmore was already waiting. At 72 years old, Arthur possessed the kind of authority that did not require volume. He rose as Evelyn entered. "Thank you for coming." Evelyn nodded politely and took a seat. For a moment, neither spoke. Arthur studied her carefully. Finally, he leaned back. "You know why I asked to see you?" Evelyn folded her hands. "I have an idea." Arthur sighed quietly. "I spent 12 years believing Dominic was the reason this company survived several crises." Evelyn remained silent. "Last night changed that." The statement carried no accusation, only recognition. Arthur opened a folder and slid several pages across the table. Internal reports. Historical forecasts. Strategic recommendations. Evelyn recognized them immediately. Documents she had prepared years earlier. Reports Dominic presented as executive leadership decisions. Arthur tapped one page gently. Every successful recovery strategy traces back to you. Evelyn looked down at the papers. She remembered writing them. Long nights. Endless revisions. Quiet work completed while others accepted credit. Arthur continued. Do you know why I never realized it? Evelyn met his eyes. Because nobody was looking for my name. Arthur nodded once. The honesty of the answer seemed to affect him more than any accusation could have. For several seconds he stared through the window toward the river. I failed you. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She appreciated the apology. But the wound was older than one man's oversight. Eventually she said, You were not the only one. Arthur accepted the answer. Then he reached for another document. This one carried current board projections, financial forecasts, risk assessments. Several sections were highlighted in yellow. Without your guidance, some of these assumptions concern me. Evelyn scanned the pages. Within moments, she identified 3 major weaknesses. 2 unrealistic projections. 1 dangerous exposure. Arthur watched her expression carefully. You found them already. A faint smile appeared. They are not difficult to find. Arthur leaned forward. That is exactly my point. At that same moment, Dominic entered the Astor Global boardroom. 12 directors occupied seats around the massive table. Usually conversations stopped when he arrived. Not today. The room remained unusually reserved. Arthur's chair sat empty. Dominic immediately noticed. Several board members avoided eye contact. Others reviewed documents with suspicious concentration. The atmosphere felt different. Controlled. Measured. Uncomfortable. For the first time in years, Dominic felt like a guest inside his own company. Back at the private conference room, Arthur closed his folder. Evelyn, there is something else. She looked up. What is it? Arthur's expression became serious. Several directors believe the company needs leadership capable of rebuilding trust. The room became very quiet. Outside, sunlight climbed higher above the river. Arthur folded his hands. And your name was mentioned. Evelyn said nothing. She simply watched him. After 12 years of being ignored, underestimated, and dismissed, she finally understood something important. The people who once overlooked her had started asking a different question. Not whether she mattered, but how much of the empire depended on her. And somewhere across the city, Dominic Astor was about to hear that same question for the very first time. The boardroom remained silent for several seconds after Dominic Astor took his seat. 12 directors sat around the polished walnut table. Some reviewed reports. Others stared through the glass walls, overlooking Manhattan. No one greeted him with the usual warmth. No one asked about his evening. Dominic immediately understood that conversations had already taken place before his arrival. The empty chair at the head of the table seemed larger than usual. Arthur Whitmore entered precisely 2 minutes later carrying a thin folder. He did not smile. He did not waste time. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the meeting. We have several urgent matters to address. The directors straightened slightly. Dominic folded his hands. Arthur began with compliance concerns, document preservation requirements, and pending reviews. The language remained professional, but the implications were impossible to ignore. Every sentence introduced another layer of uncertainty. Every report created new questions. Dominic listened carefully, waiting for an opportunity to regain control of the conversation. It never arrived. Then Arthur placed a document in the center of the table. There is another issue. Several directors exchanged glances. Dominic felt tension settle across the room. Arthur continued. Over the last 12 hours, information has emerged regarding strategic decision-making within Astor Global. Dominic frowned. What does that mean? Arthur met his eyes. It means we have been evaluating who actually created many of the recovery plans that protected this company. The room became still. Dominic felt a sudden pressure in his chest. He already knew where the discussion was heading. Arthur opened the folder. Inside were reports spanning nearly a decade. Turnaround strategies, crisis forecasts, acquisition risk assessments, market recovery models. Documents Dominic had presented repeatedly throughout his career. Arthur placed the first report on the table. Then another. Then another. Every page carried a familiar signature. Evelyn Carlyle. No title. No recognition. No public credit. Just her name. Several directors stared in silence. One elderly board member removed his glasses entirely. Another leaned back slowly, as if reconsidering years of assumptions. Dominic spoke first. Evelyn assisted with research. Arthur looked at him calmly. Research? He lifted another report. This document predicted the international currency exposure that nearly cost the company $600 million. Another report followed. This one prevented a failed acquisition. Then another. This one saved our European division during the market downturn. The directors said nothing. They were beginning to understand. Dominic attempted a controlled smile. We worked as a team. Arthur's expression never changed. Did you? The question landed heavily. Across the city, Evelyn sat in a private office overlooking the East River. For the first time in years, she was not solving someone else's emergency. Morning sunlight reflected across the water while she reviewed notes Arthur had provided. The office belonged to a temporary advisory group assisting regulators. Quiet, organized, efficient. Her phone remained face down on the desk. 12 missed calls from Dominic. 4 from Margaret Astor. 3 from Chloe Beaumont. She had answered none of them. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Arthur entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need this. Evelyn accepted the cup with a grateful smile. Arthur sat across from her. The board meeting is going exactly as expected. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Arthur looked out the window briefly. People are finally learning the difference between visibility and value. The sentence lingered between them, because that had always been the central misunderstanding. Dominic had been visible. Evelyn had been valuable. For years those distinctions remained hidden beneath wealth, status, and appearances. Not anymore. Back inside the boardroom, the atmosphere continued shifting. Questions became sharper. Directors requested clarification regarding previous decisions. Historical records were reviewed. Timelines examined. Dominic answered professionally, but confidence was beginning to crack. Then one director finally asked the question nobody had voiced before. What happens if Evelyn is no longer involved? Silence followed. Dominic looked toward Arthur. Arthur looked toward the reports. No one rushed to answer, because everyone in the room understood the danger of the question. Not the answer. The danger of needing to ask it at all. Hours earlier, Evelyn had been treated as someone easily removed. A wife. An inconvenience. A problem to be managed. Now one of the most powerful corporate boards in America was quietly debating whether their future depended on her. Meanwhile, inside the Astor mansion, Margaret stood alone in the portrait hallway. The same hallway Evelyn had walked through carrying the 2 black leather bags. Morning light filtered through tall windows. The family portraits watched from their gilded frames. For the first time, Margaret noticed something uncomfortable. None of those ancestors had built what Dominic inherited, and none of them had saved it. The woman she forced out of the house had done both. Margaret slowly lowered her eyes. Somewhere deep beneath pride and certainty, regret had begun to appear. But regret arrives late. And outside the boardroom, a confidential report had just been delivered containing information that would make the entire situation far more complicated than anyone expected. The confidential report arrived inside the boardroom shortly after noon. A senior legal advisor carried the sealed folder directly to Arthur Whitmore before taking a seat near the wall. No one spoke while Arthur reviewed the contents. The room had already endured hours of uncomfortable revelations. Yet the expression that crossed Arthur's face suggested something even more significant had surfaced. Dominic Astor watched carefully. For years he had built a career reading rooms, identifying weakness, and controlling narratives. Today the room refused to cooperate. Arthur closed the folder slowly and removed his glasses. This changes things. Several directors exchanged glances. Dominic leaned forward. What changes? Arthur looked directly at him. The report confirms that multiple strategic entities connected to Astor Global were originally structured under recommendations submitted by Evelyn Carlisle. Dominic frowned. That is not unusual. Arthur nodded once. The unusual part is that the recommendations consistently outperformed executive directives that attempted to replace them. Silence followed. One director quietly requested a copy. Another reached for a pen. Arthur continued. The review team compared 12 years of internal planning. Whenever Evelyn's recommendations were followed, risk exposure decreased. Whenever her recommendations were ignored, losses increased. The room grew very still. Numbers have a unique power. Opinions can be debated. Emotions can be dismissed. Data is harder to argue with. Dominic felt the ground shifting beneath him. Not because the information was false, because it was true. Across the city, Evelyn Carlisle sat in a temporary office reviewing old financial records. The room was simple. No marble floors. No private elevator. No personal staff. Just a desk, a window, and a quiet sense of clarity she had not experienced in years. Her phone vibrated again. Dominic. She stared at his name without answering. Eventually, the call stopped. Seconds later, a message appeared. "We need to talk." Evelyn looked out the window toward the river. How many times had she tried to talk over the last 12 years? How many warnings had gone unheard? How many concerns had been dismissed as overthinking? She placed the phone face down once more. Some conversations arrived too late. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Arthur entered carrying another folder. He seemed tired. Not physically, morally, as though he had spent the morning revising years of assumptions. He sat across from her. "There is something I need you to see." Evelyn opened the folder. Inside were board evaluations dating back almost a decade. Leadership reviews. Strategic assessments. Executive succession plans. She turned several pages before stopping. Her own name appeared repeatedly. Recommendations for greater responsibility. Advisory appointments. Executive leadership consideration. Every proposal carried the same notation beside it. Deferred. 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 Evelyn stared at the pages quietly. Arthur watched her expression. "You never knew?" She shook her head. Arthur sighed. "Several directors recognized your contributions years ago." Evelyn continued reading. "Then why did nothing happen?" Arthur looked toward the window. "Because Dominic always insisted he could not operate without you in your current role." The irony settled heavily between them. Evelyn almost laughed. Not from amusement. From recognition. For years Dominic claimed she was indispensable. Yet he never allowed that value to become visible. Arthur folded his hands. "I should have questioned it sooner." Evelyn closed the folder gently. Most people only notice foundations when buildings begin to shake. Back at the Astor mansion, Chloe Beaumont sat alone in the breakfast room, staring at untouched coffee. The atmosphere inside the house had changed dramatically. Staff members spoke less. Calls went unanswered. News outlets were beginning to ask questions. The confidence she carried only 2 days earlier was disappearing. For the first time, Chloe began to understand that luxury and security were not the same thing. She remembered standing beside Dominic while Evelyn carried the black leather bags through the foyer. She remembered calling her dramatic. Poor. The memory now felt uncomfortable, because everyone around her seemed increasingly interested in the woman who had left, not the woman who stayed. Upstairs, Margaret Astor sat before a collection of family photographs. One image captured Dominic at 28. Young. Ambitious. Standing beside Evelyn at a charity event long before the private jets and magazine covers. Margaret stared at the photograph longer than she intended. She remembered that version of her son. He listened more then. Smiled more. Asked Evelyn's opinion constantly. Somewhere along the journey, gratitude had transformed into entitlement. Success had become expectation. And now the consequences were arriving. Meanwhile, inside the boardroom, directors reviewed the confidential report in complete silence. Page after page told the same story. The company everyone admired had not been built by one brilliant man. It had been sustained by a woman whose name rarely appeared anywhere. One director finally looked up. "Does Evelyn know all of this?" Arthur considered the question carefully. "I think she always knew." The director frowned. "Then why did she never demand recognition?" Arthur looked toward the skyline beyond the glass. His answer came quietly. "Because she was busy keeping the company alive." The room fell silent once more. But at that exact moment, another message appeared on Evelyn's phone. This one did not come from Dominic. It came from a national business network requesting an exclusive interview. And the subject line contained a phrase she had never expected to see. The woman behind Astor Global. The message from the business network remained open on Evelyn Carlisle's screen long after she finished reading it. The woman behind Astor Global. For years, journalists had interviewed Dominic. Photographers had followed Dominic. Financial magazines had celebrated Dominic. Now, for the first time, someone was asking about the person standing behind the spotlight. Evelyn placed the phone on her desk and looked out at the river. The invitation did not feel like victory. It felt like evidence. Evidence that the story was finally changing. A second message arrived moments later. Then a third. Financial reporters. Industry analysts. Executive recruiters. Board members from companies she had never worked with. The pattern was impossible to ignore. People were beginning to connect names to outcomes. Contributions to results. value to performance. Across the city, Dominic Astor watched the same shift unfold in real time. His communications team occupied the conference room beside his office. Television screens displayed financial coverage from multiple networks. Headlines rotated continuously. Questions about compliance reviews. Questions about governance. Questions about leadership. Then one headline appeared that made the room fall silent. Who really built Astor Global? Dominic stared at the screen. A photograph of Evelyn appeared beside the headline. Not a recent photograph. An older one from a charity event years earlier. She stood quietly in a red dress beside him, smiling politely while reporters focused their cameras elsewhere. The image felt almost cruel now, because everyone looking at it suddenly wanted to know the same thing. Why had nobody been paying attention to her? Dominic turned away from the screen and walked toward the windows. Behind him, advisors discussed strategy, public statements, reputation management, investor communication. Their voices blended into background noise. His attention remained fixed on one uncomfortable realization. He had spent years believing he was protecting the company. Yet every new report suggested someone else had been protecting both the company and him. Meanwhile, Evelyn arrived at a private dining room overlooking the East River. Arthur Whitmore had arranged a small meeting with 3 board directors. No reporters, no attorneys, no cameras, just conversation. The room featured white tablecloths, polished silverware, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline. One director stood as she entered. Another extended his hand immediately. Their respect felt genuine. Not performative, not strategic. Genuine. That difference mattered. During lunch, they discussed markets, leadership, risk management, and company culture. The conversation flowed naturally because, unlike many executive meetings Evelyn attended in the past, nobody interrupted her. Nobody explained her own ideas back to her. Nobody treated her expertise as surprising. One director eventually asked a question. If you had complete authority, what would you change first? Evelyn considered the answer carefully. Then she smiled faintly. I would start listening to the people doing the work. The directors exchanged knowing glances. Arthur looked amused. Simple. Evelyn nodded. Most important things usually are. Across town, Chloe Beaumont sat inside a luxury apartment she had once considered a symbol of success. The space remained beautiful. Marble counters, designer furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows. Yet everything felt different now. Her social media accounts had become unusually quiet. Invitations stopped arriving. Messages went unanswered. People who once rushed to stand beside power were suddenly stepping away from uncertainty. Chloe opened an article discussing Astor Global. Halfway through reading, she stopped. The article mentioned Evelyn repeatedly. Strategic advisor, financial architect, crisis manager, industry expert. Chloe lowered the phone slowly. For the first time, she understood something painful. She had never replaced Evelyn. She had only replaced Evelyn's seat at the table. The value remained with the woman who left. Back at the restaurant, lunch ended with coffee and quiet conversation. Arthur waited until the others stepped away before speaking. There is something else you should know. Evelyn looked up. Arthur slid a folder across the table. Inside was a preliminary board recommendation. Evelyn scanned the pages once. Then again. Her expression remained calm, but Arthur noticed the change immediately. You were not expecting that. Evelyn closed the folder gently. No. The recommendation proposed a special advisory position reporting directly to the board. Independent from executive leadership. Independent from Dominic. Independent from everything that had limited her influence before. Arthur folded his hands. Several directors insisted on it. Evelyn looked out the window. Boats moved slowly across the river below. The city continued functioning exactly as it had yesterday. Yet her life felt entirely different. For years she had been asked to support someone else's future. Now people were asking about hers. The distinction was profound. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. This one from Dominic. Only 4 words appeared on the screen. I was wrong. Evelyn stared at the message for several seconds. 12 years of marriage. 12 years of sacrifice. 12 years of silence. Reduced to 4 words. She locked the phone without replying. Not because she was angry. Not because she wanted revenge. Because some realizations arrive after consequences. And consequences do not disappear simply because someone finally understands them. As she slipped the phone into her purse, Arthur received a call. He listened briefly before ending it. Then he looked at Evelyn with an expression she had not seen before. Concern mixed with surprise. "What happened?" she asked. Arthur exhaled slowly. "The board just received another report." Evelyn waited. Arthur's voice lowered. "This one is not about compliance." The room grew quiet. Arthur looked directly at her. "It is about ownership. And according to the documents, Aster Global may not belong to the people everyone assumes it belongs to." Arthur Whitmore's words lingered in the air long after he spoke them. Ownership. The term seemed almost simple compared to compliance reviews, investigations, and board conflicts. Yet Evelyn Carlyle immediately understood why his expression had changed. Ownership determined power. Ownership determined control. Ownership determined who remained standing when everything else shifted. Arthur placed a thick folder on the table between them. The cover carried dates stretching back more than a decade. The board commissioned a historical review after questions emerged about several early financing structures, he explained. Evelyn opened the folder carefully. The first pages contained formation documents from Aster Global's earliest years. Before private jets, before international offices, before magazine covers, before anyone outside a small group of people knew the company's name. As she turned the pages, memories returned. Small apartments, folding tables, late nights, coffee growing cold beside financial models. Dominic making presentations while she reviewed numbers until dawn. The company had once been little more than hope and spreadsheets. Arthur watched her quietly. "Keep reading." Several pages later, Evelyn stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly. There it was. An agreement she had not seen in years. One of the original financing structures created when Aster Global nearly collapsed during its first major expansion. At the time, investors refused additional funding. Banks considered the company too risky. Dominic had exhausted almost every option available. Arthur sat back. "You remember it?" Evelyn nodded slowly. She remembered everything. The agreement was signed 11 years earlier after she contributed nearly all her personal assets to stabilize operations. Savings, investments, property inherited from her grandmother. Everything. Dominic promised it was temporary. A bridge solution until the company recovered. They were married. She trusted him completely. Arthur tapped a highlighted section. Most people never read this closely. Evelyn looked down. Her pulse slowed, then stopped. Not literally. Emotionally. Because for the first time in years, she saw the clause clearly. The provision had never expired. The protective conversion structure remained active. The ownership rights attached to it remained valid. The silence that followed felt enormous. Arthur folded his hands. According to the review team, that agreement was never amended. Evelyn continued staring at the page. 11 years. 11 years of board meetings. Acquisitions. Expansions. International growth. Public recognition. Yet one forgotten document remained untouched beneath everything. Arthur spoke carefully. "The legal interpretation is still under review." Evelyn finally looked up. "But..." Arthur exhaled slowly. "But preliminary findings suggest your ownership position may be substantially larger than anyone realized." Across Manhattan, Dominic Astor sat inside his office reviewing reports from attorneys. Every hour brought another problem. Yet none of them prepared him for the call that arrived shortly after 3 o'clock. His chief legal officer entered without knocking, a habit she had never broken in 15 years. Today she looked unusually serious. "We have an issue." Dominic rubbed his temples. "Get in line." She remained standing. "This one is different." He looked up. "How different?" The attorney placed a file on his desk. Dominic opened it. Several seconds passed. Then his expression changed completely. "This is impossible." The attorney said nothing. Dominic flipped through the pages again. Original financing agreements. Historical ownership structures. Legal reviews. The same documents Evelyn had examined. The same forgotten signatures. The same forgotten clause. Dominic stared at the final page. For years he believed Aster Global belonged to him. Suddenly that certainty no longer existed. Meanwhile, news coverage continued spreading. Business networks debated leadership questions. Financial analysts discussed governance concerns. Social media amplified stories about Evelyn's role inside the company. The narrative was evolving rapidly. Once she had been invisible. Now journalists described her as strategist, architect, and builder. Inside her temporary office later that afternoon, Evelyn reviewed interview requests she had no intention of accepting. Fame did not interest her. Recognition felt strange after so many years. What mattered was something else. Truth. For the first time, people were discussing facts instead of appearances. Her phone vibrated softly. Another message from Dominic. Longer this time. Evelyn, please call me. There are things we need to discuss. She read the words without emotion. Not because she hated him. Not because she enjoyed his discomfort. Because distance had created clarity. She finally understood how often urgency appears only after power begins to disappear. Evelyn set the phone aside. Outside her window, sunlight reflected across the East River. Boats moved slowly through the afternoon. The city carried on. Arthur arrived an hour later carrying yet another folder. His expression was impossible to read. More documents? Evelyn asked. Arthur shook his head. Not documents. He sat down across from her. The preliminary legal opinion just arrived. The room became quiet. Evelyn waited. Arthur opened the folder and read a single paragraph before looking up. His voice remained calm, but the significance of the words was unmistakable. If the opinion survives final review, you may not simply be connected to Astor Global. He paused briefly. You may be the single largest individual owner. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. 11 years ago, she had offered everything she had to save a struggling company. Today, that forgotten sacrifice had returned in a form neither she nor Dominic ever imagined. And somewhere across Manhattan, a board emergency meeting was being scheduled because the directors had just learned the same thing.